Cool. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Cold, dreary Wednesday. This is the Graduate Writing Symposium, and today we're going to be talking about writing literature reviews. My name is Spencer.
And I'm Jason.
And we're the graduate writing consultants at the Writing Center here at U of I. And we're also actually both MFA candidates in creative writing. So we spend pretty much all of our waking hours thinking about writing in some way, shape, or form. If you aren't already aware, at the Graduate Writing Center, we offer guidance and support for graduate students across the university as they work on theses, dissertations, article manuscripts, applications, and writing projects really in any genre. And we provide our services totally for free to graduate students and faculty anywhere in the university. And we're both offer our services in person in third floor of ISUB in room 323, as well as online over Zoom, similar to what we're doing today. I just realized that I am not sharing a PowerPoint, so let me do that real quick. Give me 1 second. And then we'll get going. Okay. Okay, so writing literature reviews, as we said. Okay, so an important note before we get started today. Today's workshop is going to offer, a really broad overview of the writing process for literature reviews. We've designed it to be, as applicable as possible to the widest range of graduate student writers. But of course, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So if you have a specific question that we don't answer during our presentation today, just take note of it. We're going to have a little Q&A session at the end of our presentation today. Hopefully, we can answer some of your questions then. Additionally, if you'd like us to take a look at a draft of a literature review, or maybe some brainstorming ideas, getting you started with a literature review, go ahead and schedule an appointment for us. We'll throw the link to our website in the chat here sometime soon, and from there you can make an appointment with us, and we'll work individually with you one-on-one on your literature reviews. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. So what is a literature review? Presumably, because you're at this workshop, you know what a literature review is. You're probably maybe working on one right now, or at the very least, you will need to write one soon. That said, I still think it's important to start with the basics, right? So a literature review might best be described as an overview of any prior research that has been conducted on a particular subject, right? So for example, if you are writing a research project on a specific subject, let's say agricultural intercropping, then your literature review is going to provide an overview of the prior research on intercropping, right? Of course, this definition is pretty broad. It's accurate, but it's pretty broad. And it doesn't really help us understand why you are being asked to write a literature review. So what are the reasons why we write one? In general, there are going to be a number of purposes that a literature review typically aims to accomplish. So first and foremost, a literature review collects key sources on a topic, and it discusses those sources in conversation with one another. And in writing studies, we call this process of putting sources in conversation with one another, we call that synthesis. And Jason will actually talk more about that later today. Second, a literature review can help readers familiarize themselves with a topic if it is new to them. And along the same lines, the lit review can actually also make other scholars' lives much easier, right? By gathering the process of you in writing a literature review, you gathering that research, it allows other scholars to, be able to skip past that part of the process and be able to just have that gathered research ready for them when they start their own projects. Third, a literature review is often going to identify gaps in that existing research. And that's usually with a stated goal of filling those gaps in through the research that you are going to be conducting. And hopefully that's going to help readers identify and understand how your research, right, furthers the conversation of your topic in the field of study. So the literature review talks about what's been happening and then leads into what you're doing to keep that conversation moving forward. And then finally, last but not least, the process of reviewing existing research actually also allows you to fine tune your own research questions. In fact, you may find that in writing a literature review, your own understanding of your research and study results is going to begin to evolve the more you learn about your own topic. So it's even helpful for you as the researcher. And so with these general purposes in mind, I want to offer one caveat, and that it's important to remember that when we discuss the purpose of a particular genre of writing, whether that's a literature review or any kind of writing, some part of that purpose is going to be particular to you, right? As a researcher, as an individual, as a writer, and it's going to be particular to your subject, right? And so you're going to need to discover parts of your processes and your purposes through your own writing process. And so now I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Jason, and he's going to talk about this bigger picture of your individual writing literature review.
Okay. So while all literature reviews share the general purposes that Spencer discussed, there are also outcomes that will be specific to your literature review in its rhetorical context. Literature reviews can be included in different types of documents, such as a dissertation, an article, or a classroom assignment. The type of document that one is crafting and the literature review's relationship to the document at large will influence some of the rhetorical outcomes that are most appropriate for one's literature review. Next, we will explore some of the structural and rhetorical conventions for each of these documents. So first, lit reviews and academic articles. Researchers often include literature reviews and academic articles that communicate their research. In these cases, the literature review is performed to demonstrate the student's knowledge of the fields of study that the student's research engages with. Additionally, literature reviews give students the opportunity to contextualize the contributions that their research makes to these fields of study. Academic articles are shorter than theses and dissertations, usually ranging between 15 and 25 pages in length, give or take. Academic articles are relatively focused and condensed in discussing one's research, which also applies to the literature review that justifies it. In Angelica Hoffman's book, Scientific Writing and Communication, she writes that literature reviews tend to be focused and non-exhaustive. She also notes that academic articles often include literature reviews as part of the introduction section and are sometimes referred to as background or the background section. For shorter literature reviews, Hoffman offers an outline for organizing one's sources. First, a literature review should engage with any sources that offers the necessary background information that a reader needs to understand one's research and its significance. Second, the literature review should discuss what is unknown or unresolved about the relevant research. Third, the literature review should communicate the purpose of one's study, describing how the research will address the gaps or unresolved ideas that are presented in the literature review. Fourth, if applicable, the literature review should discuss the methodological approaches of the research and how these approaches address the gaps in the field. Okay, third, lit reviews for theses and dissertations. More exhaustive literature reviews are often included as part of a student's thesis or dissertation project. Like those found in an academic article, the literature review found in theses and dissertations seeks to contextualize the contributions of the research in question. While Hoffman's four steps still apply to the overall structure of any literature review that works to these outcomes, the literature review in these documents are usually broken into smaller subtopics in order to offer clearer networks of relation to both the writer and the audience of the document. Since literature reviews in these documents often have more complex structures, theses and dissertations often dedicate their own section to the literature review, usually following the introduction section. Okay, so I'm sorry, I know I said theses and dissertations third, but now actually third, literature reviews as their own documents. While literature reviews can be a section of another document, they can also serve as their own research articles. Researchers will often publish contained literature reviews when surveying the state of the research, is central to the document's purpose. Oftentimes, researchers will publish literature reviews in academic journals independently of a specific research project. These documents serve other researchers in the field by discussing the state of the research and pointing to areas in which the research can be further investigated and developed. Similarly, professors may assign their students to compose literature reviews as a class assignment. This process helps students identify the gaps in the existing research in order to propose new projects and/or develop a theoretical framework and methodology for later research. The University of California, San Diego's psychology department expands upon the literature reviews in longer projects. They break the full-length literature review article into a three-part structure. An introduction section, where the topic is identified and any trends or major problems in the literature can be introduced. Body sections, where the studies that compromise the literature of that topic are discussed. In discussion and conclusion, where major patterns and points are discussed and the general state of what is known about the topic is summarized. So as you may have noticed, an effective literature review will always conclude by turning to the gaps in the research, usually drawing on what research needs to be performed to address these gaps. If a literature review is connected to a research project, it will conclude by relating the research to the gaps in the literature, thus justifying the demand for the research in question. While literature reviews often draw their own conclusions, their takeaways can also introduce other components of a research document, including research questions, hypotheses, or thesis statements. This is more common in shorter documents or any for which the literature review is a part of the introduction section. Now, in some cases, deciding on these structures and rhetorical, deciding on these structures and rhetorical choices can feel rather arbitrary. While there are conventions that we can associate with these structures, there are also conventions that are particular to one's field of study and even the source that one may be submitting to. Though these choices can be difficult to make, trying to make them early on can make the rest of the writing process feel more streamlined and accessible. There are some steps that one can take to make these choices early in the process. Some of these include referencing journals and databases to look for conventions in closely related documents. Second, consulting with mentors in your field. And third, and my favorite, booking an appointment at the Graduate Writing Center with Spencer or myself. Now, when crafting a plan, a few good questions to start with include the following. I need to demonstrate my knowledge in the field, but why? Is it to show my understanding of the course material? Is it to contextualize the contributions of my research? For many of you, the answer to both of these may be yes. And then secondly, you may want to ask, will my literature be part of an introduction, its own section, or its own document? Now, before we move on, Spencer and I have already given you all a lot of information so far. So we want to take a moment and slow down and give you all a chance to answer some of these preliminary questions. So we're going to give you all a few minutes to open a document or find a writing utensil and maybe address these two questions. And then we will resume in a minute or two.
Yeah,
that's
good. Maybe another 30 seconds, just finding your answers to these two questions on screen.
Okay, so now that you've specified the role of your literature review, its relationship to the document, and some of your desired rhetorical outcomes, I'm going to hand it over to Spencer, who's going to guide you all through some of the steps to actually writing the literature review.
Cool. All right, thanks, Jason. Okay, so we got the big picture of the literature review in mind, right? So with that, let's go ahead and turn to the main reason why we're here today, right? To talk about the literature review writing process. And when we talk about the literature, the writing process in general, we're not simply talking about the time that you actually spend writing words on paper, right? For every writing project, whether that's a literature review or something else, the writing process begins from that first moment of ideation, from the first moment you start doing research. And it actually ends when you make your final revisions on your final draft, right? So in other words, it's a really long process. And we're not going to, of course, have time to talk about to every step in depth in that process, but we would like to get started with a step-by-step overview, okay? So if you come to the Writing Center, here's how we would break down the process of writing literature. First, selecting a topic, right? Second, searching, surveying, and critiquing literature. Third, determining the structure and building an outline for the review. And then last, but of course, certainly not least, writing the review, which mainly includes the process of summarizing and synthesizing the literature. So in their book on writing a literature review, Lawrence Mackey and Brenda McAvoy frame the literature review writing process in this way. They say that a literature review is an organized way to research a chosen topic. And the simple fact is that doing a literature review is an exercise in applied critical thinking. Okay, so even those of you who feel like you're not writers, but you are critical thinkers, well, guess what? Writing a literature review, critical thinking process. And so this idea that the literature review is a critical thinking process, that's foundational to the writing process of writing. So let's dive into each of these steps. First, selecting a topic. So the focus on critical thinking, right? It starts with this first step. For many writers, by the time that you've started writing your literature review, you've already chosen your topic, right? Which means it's probably the same one as your research project. However, even if you are writing a literature review for your research project, it's still important to think critically about what literature you need to cover in your review. So with that in mind, here are a few questions that you can help that can help you begin to identify what you need to consider in selecting your topic for your literature. So first question, what is your specific personal interest in this research topic? In other words, what do you want your literature review to cover? And answering this question, I think, is going to be really helpful for you to be aware of your own beliefs, your own values, your own biases even. That will help you determine what past research you will choose to review and the perspectives that you hold about that research. Second question, what are the format and length expectations for your literature review? It's important to know these expectations, right? Whether it's a short literature review, maybe a few paragraphs long, whether it's a chapter, whether there are specific expectations for the article that you're publishing and with the publisher. And it's important to know all these things before you settle on your topic. That way, you know how extensive or how limited your literature review needs to be, right? It helps you determine what you should review and also what you can review. Third, what are the key concepts and terms within your area of study? So having a list of these terms, these key terms and these concepts is going to help you know where to start in the research process. It's also going to help in outlining with the topics and the themes that you will use to build that outline. And again, we'll get to outlining here in a few minutes. And last but not least, when you're selecting a topic, asking yourself, is your subject of inquiry clearly defined and focused? For example, if your topic is too large, right? Say that you got too much to talk about, it's going to be hard to write a really comprehensive and focused literature review, right? But if your subject is too narrow, on the other hand, it may be difficult to find enough references that can actually build a comprehensive literature review. But if it is clearly defined and focused, meaning it finds itself somewhere between being too narrow and too large, the writing process is going to be much less stressful for you. So that is our tips on selecting a topic. Let's go ahead and move to our second step, which is searching, surveying, and critiquing the literature. So the second step of the literature review writing process is to find and engage the literature that you will review. So as the critical thinking process, remember, we're always thinking about this writing process as a critical thinking exercise. This step can actually be broken down into 3 substeps. That's going to be searching the literature, surveying the literature, and then critiquing the literature. So searching the literature. Finding the literature that you will review is going to be a process of strategic data collection. According to Maki and McAvoy, there are actually 3 tools that you can practice through this searching process. And those are scanning, skimming, and mapping. And each of these tools, we're gonna help you think about them by comparing them to the process of putting together a jigsaw puzzle, okay? So scanning. When you scan the literature, this is when you're opening up the puzzle box, right? You're laying all the pieces out on the table and you're searching for the keywords. You're searching for author indices to help you identify the borders of the puzzle, right? The borders of your literature review. And you're removing any pieces that you don't find useful, okay? Skimming. When you skim the literature, you are working with those puzzle pieces that you identified in the scanning process. And you're skimming each paper for their individual appropriateness in the study, right? You might be asking, what part of this work addressed the subject of inquiry, and in what way did it address the subject of inquiry? And then lastly, mapping. When you map the literature, you are starting to put the puzzle together, right? You are identifying key ideas in the literature and you're organizing your sources around them and putting them into piles. Here's this topic, here's this topic, right? And you're noting the specific contributions that each piece will make when explaining the topic. And this mapping process, putting things into piles, creating a sense of the structure and order of things, is really going to be helpful for the next step in next substep in step 2, which is surveying the literature. So in this step, you're going to go ahead and dive really deeply into the literature. This is the meat of the research process, where you're actually really reading through papers and engaging with what they have to say. Because you've already searched through the literature because you've already scanned, skimmed, and mapped, this process is much easier, right? You already have the papers that you need to look at. You don't need to find new papers necessarily. And in searching the literature, right, you were collecting pertinent data about the research topic. In surveying the literature, you are looking at all of that collected data and you're asking yourself a question. What is known about the topic? So in answering this question, what is known about the topic, you're going to interpret, you're going to analyze the literature of your chosen, that you've chosen to review, and you're going to start forming conclusions about the topic of the study. And that's going to take us to the third sub-step, critiquing the literature. Now, by critique, we don't necessarily mean to find its flaws, right? Sometimes critiquing literature can be argumentative in this way. That's especially the case in humanities. But more often, critiquing means that you are examining, you are discovering gaps in the current research. So again, in surveying the literature, you asked what is known about this topic. In critiquing the literature, you are asking, based on what we know, what conclusions can be drawn and what questions remain unanswered. Now, ideally, your research project is going to aim to address some of these questions, but it probably won't answer all of them, right? And this is an important thing to consider. What questions are you going to answer? Because you don't want to ask questions in a literature review that you don't actually plan on engaging with later in your study. That wouldn't make sense, right? Before we move on to our third step of the writing process, I do want to take a moment to point out that this process, scanning, surveying, and critiquing the literature, is a cyclical one. It's kind of why I have it in this kind of in this frame. In an ideal world, right, we could just move from searching to surveying to critiquing smoothly and without error, never having to turn around and go back to the next one or go back to a previous step. But of course, that's not how the writing process works, right? For example, you may realize when you are critiquing literature on, let's say, barley and pea intercropping, right, that you need to search for a paper that better discusses drought stress on these crops, but you don't have that paper yet. So now you need to go back to the searching process and begin the process again for that idea, that paper. And this is totally okay, right? This happens to everybody in the writing process. And even though it may be frustrating, the cyclic quality to the research process should be expected and it should be embraced. Okay. So moving on to step number 3. This is determining the structure and building an outline. So in the third step of the literature review writing process, you're going to begin developing an outline of the literature review. And to do this, the first thing that we need to do is actually determine the structure of the literature review. What structure is it going to take? Purdue's online writing lab, Purdue OWL, offers 4 really comprehensive structural options for your literature review. And Jason and I kind of think that these 4 structural options cover the structural concerns that most writers are going to encounter in their writing process. So let's go through it. So first, we have a chronological structure. And this is when, of course, writers trace the development of topics over time, right? And it's going to help them familiarize the audience with a topic. And so in choosing this strategy, writers do need to be careful with things. First, they need to be careful to avoid simply listing and summarizing sources in order, right? Like a bad chronological literature review would say, in 1991, this happened, and in 1996, this happened, right? Instead, you're going to try and analyze patterns and turning points and key debates that have shaped the direction of the field. So that's a chronological structure. Second option, a thematic structure. This second structure works best, Purdue says, quote, if you have found some recurring central themes that you will continue working with throughout your piece, and that you can organize the literature into subsections that address different aspects of the topic. So instead of thinking of it chronologically in 1991 to 1996, these things happened. Maybe both the 1991 and the 1996 papers are talking about the same thing, but they're talking about them in different ways. So in this case, a thematic structure would be more helpful for your organization of your literature review. Third, we have a methodological structure. And this structure is best if you're drawing from sources from different disciplines, right? Or fields that use a variety of research methods. Purdue says that you can compare the results and conclusions to emerge from these different approaches. So they offer a few examples. First is like qualitative versus quantitative research, right? Two different kinds, very, very central kinds of research that usually rely on different research methods and privilege different results, right? Feel very different, but in a literature review, a methodological literature review, you can compare and contrast those conclusions from these two separate kinds of research. Another one would be empirical versus theoretical scholarship, right? Like hard facts versus ideas. And with this concept, right, you might find yourself trying to find comparisons between these hard facts and the theoretical ideas that they are based upon. And last but not least, you might divide the research by like sociological, historical, and cultural sources, right? Finding different foci that you can separate your literature review into. A section on culture, a section on history, a section on sociology, etc. So that's a methodological approach. And then for our last structure, we have theoretical. A theoretical approach, most common in the humanities. So for any humanities students here, this is for you. Purdue says that you can use a theoretical structure to discuss various theories, models, and definitions of key concepts. And through this conversation, you're going to argue for the relevance of a specific theoretical approach, or combine various theoretical concepts to create a framework for your research, right? So when we go back to thinking about critiquing the literature, this is where you're going to find most actual critique, right? Where you're actually arguing for a specific position. Okay, so once a structure is determined, then it's time to start building that outline, right? Now, if you're anything like me and you hear the word outline, you always get like a little annoyed, right? My brain kind of just wants to just like jump right into it, right? I don't want to sit there and think about like how I'm actually going to talk about my ideas. But I always have to remind myself that outlining is actually going to help keep my writing streamlined. It's going to keep my drafts focused, and it's actually going to save me a lot of time and save me a lot of frustration further down the line. So Maki and McAvoy actually have some really helpful things to say about outlining. First, they say that outlining serves three purposes. Number one, it acts as a mechanism for integrating and transforming ideas. Two, a mechanism for sequencing those ideas. And three, a general plan for the composition of the review. And just like the actual draft of your literature review, your outline, it's not going to be finished in one go, right? You're probably going to end up writing multiple drafts of that outline. And you might start with a really basic shell of your ideas and then build and expand from there. And that first basic shell can be an incredibly minimal one, right? Just listing basic concepts and ideas and themes. But Maki and McAvoy actually recommend, and I love this idea, that the first draft of your outline can serve the dual purpose as your table of contents. So before you even start beginning to write your literature review, write out its table of contents. Now, of course, writing a table of contents may not be super useful for like a short literature review, but for a longer literature review, the table of contents becomes this frame for the composition by laying out the major sections of the work in a logical fashion. And then as an added plus, you won't have to create that table of contents later from scratch when you're finalizing that review, which if anybody else here is writing your dissertation or thesis for the university, huge headache. Get rid of that right from the go and just have a table of contents ready from the start. Okay. So once a draft of the outline is finished, now we need to review it for specificity, right? So for example, you might ask yourself some or all of the following questions. We'll just move through these really quick. Which authors will be most important to reference in each section of the review? Right? Have you done that? What specific topics will receive their own sections and subsections in the review? And have you included them all in the outline, right? Did you miss any? Are any of them in the wrong places? Have you omitted any and all instances of repetitious information, right? Don't want to repeat things if it's not necessary. And lastly, and probably most importantly, does the outline flow from one main idea to the next, right, in a reasoned fashion? Or do you need to rethink the review structure? Does it feel choppy, or are you moving back and forth between topics in some strange way? That outline is going to help you visualize that and help you make those changes. Okay, so where are we? Thank you. There are many different ways to create an effective outline, right? And we're not going to be able to cover all of them today. Instead, we'd like to offer one way to outline your literature review that is both really visually and conceptually helpful. And that's going to be funneling, okay? In their literature review article on writing literature reviews, Andrew Denny and Richard Tewksbury discuss funneling this way, and I have to put it on screen. It is best to think of the literature review collectively as a funnel that starts out as a big opening, right, and travels to a much narrower, finite end, okay? And in essence, this means that the literature review needs to go from broad to specific. The broad beginning needs to open with a general research question, and then each theme and subtopic needs to naturally narrow to focus on a specific research question that will be addressed in the present study, right? So put simply, as this structural concept, funneling can help you organize your ideas in order of importance, from most broad to most specific to the topic and the purpose of your study. So instead of simply talking about funneling, though, I'm actually going to hand things back over to Jason, and he'll lead us through a short activity that will actually help you develop your own funneling outlines.
All right. Hello, everyone, again. So again, we're going to slow down and we're going to do a funneling activity, as Spencer mentioned. So for this activity, you will need a piece of paper and a writing utensil, if you have one. A pencil is ideal, but a pen will work too. So as we go through these steps, I'm gonna give everyone a step, and then we'll pause and we'll give everyone an opportunity to perform that step, starting with a moment right now for everyone to get a pencil and pen or paper if you need one. So we'll wait, we'll give everyone like 30 seconds and then we'll resume. Okay, so what we're working toward is we're going to try to make a diagram that's kind of resembles the one on your screen here. So to start this activity, we're going to ask you to draw a funnel on a piece of paper, and make sure that you leave plenty of space in the margins of your page. You're welcome to draw lines as they are represented on the screen, but if you want to wait and draw the lines, you are welcome to do that as well. Okay, so next we're going to start by writing an intervention statement. Think of this as a type of thesis, but one that specifically communicates how your research will intervene in the current state of the literature. If your research will intervene in multiple ways, Please feel free to write a more extensive statement, but you don't have to. You can just write a simpler one to get started. If you don't have a specific project in mind, your intervention statement can focus on the gaps in uncertainties that your literature review may identify and address. We will use these intervention statements as our anchors, the central ideas that we will try to funnel our references toward. So I give everyone maybe about a minute or two to write that intervention, maybe 2 minutes to write that intervention statement. Okay, so next we will label the outside of our funnels. At the top of our funnels, we will write the label background information. Near the bottom of the funnel, we write the label gaps and uncertainties. Now, between these labels, your task is to consider how you can order your research topics so that they funnel from broad discussion of the background information to the specific gaps that your research will address. It may be useful to write these topics in a list before labeling them on your funnel, especially if you're using a pen. Now, for these topics, they don't necessarily have to be topics. They could be different types of methodologies or different theoretical frameworks that your research may engage with. I think right now we just have topics up there, and you can adapt those labels to whatever feels like the best fit for your research. Okay, so now that we have our funnels labeled, our task is to fill in the inside of our funnel with sources that we might include in our literature reviews. At each level of the funnel, we challenge you to list a few sources that feel appropriate for that level. You can label these sources using an author's last name or an abbreviated title. For now, the order of the sources within each level does not matter. Now, some of you may not be at the stage where you have sources in mind yet. If that's the case, please feel free to maybe try to describe some of the types of sources that you might anticipate fitting in at each of these levels. Okay, so now that we have our funnels completed, we kind of have a starting point from which you all may be ready to start thinking about the outlining process. So with that completed, we're going to go on and thinking about the actual drafting process of the literature review. So once the writer has considered what sources one will relate to one's research, one is ready to begin drafting the document. Writing a literature review is the process of synthesizing the sources that help contextualize the intervention of one's research. In simple terms, synthesizing sources is the process of placing sources in conversation with each other. Synthesis differs from summary in that synthesis places focus on the relationships between the sources while also discussing the most important aspects of the sources themselves. As you may begin to see in your funnel, literature reviews often have to consider multiple networks of relation between the sources they discuss. As one compiles sources for a literature review, one will likely begin to see patterns, contradictions, and gaps arise between the sources. A rhetorically effective literature review will discuss these different methods of relation explicitly as it funnels toward its justification for a certain type of research. There are many factors that can determine the networks of relations in a literature review, including the purposes, methodologies, interpretations, and available data that each of one's references draws from. Researchers can make these networks of relation more clear by using strong transitional phrases as the literature review moves through and between the clusters of relation that it creates. Transitional phrases such as similarly, by contrast, or while source X concludes, and so on, reduces the burden of inference and the possibility of misinterpretation for the document's audience. Tracking these networks of relation and identifying ways to cluster sources through these relationships can be a difficult task, especially if one defers these considerations until they get to the drafting process. The more that one can think about these relationships while one compiles sources, the easier the drafting process will be for the researcher. To help researchers think about these relationships early in the process, we recommend using a synthesis matrix while they are compiling sources. A synthesis matrix is a spreadsheet that helps one organize references while also identifying the relationships between sources and the themes that connect them. While creating a reference funnel can help one think about the big picture and structure of one's literature review, a synthesis matrix can help one focus on the more granular relationships that the literature review will eventually discuss. And we think that these two tools can be really great complements to one another as one works through the early stages of one's writing process, and and tools that one can refer back to as they go through the middle and later stages as well. So with those tools in mind, we're going to kind of conclude the kind of informational part of this workshop, and we're going to end with a Q&A. We know that you all are working on your own on your own literature reviews, and that you're all kind of on your at different steps of the process. And so we do want to create time for anyone to ask any questions that may be specific to where they are at. And it's likely that someone else in the workshop has a similar or relevant question or related question.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Thanks so much. This is really helpful. I had a question in general, if you guys had any resources as far as like I know Sage has a like kind of a self-paced module for literature review training. Is there anything, this is a great foundation that you guys presented, but is there anything that you all would recommend that maybe for those of us that are wanting to dive in a little bit more deeper, if you had any like self-paced modules that you would recommend or anything.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of our sources, and we'll have a references page here to show you in a second that that does not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily like self-paced module, but they do have like a more, I guess, kind of like how we've walked you through this process. All of our sources have their own kind of process to walk through. I also will show you the book that I was referencing. I got this from the library. I know you can't really read it backwards there.
Oh, yeah.
It's The Literature Review, 6 Steps to Success by Lawrence Mackey and Brenda McAvoy. I got this from the library. I'm going to return it as soon as we're done with today. And I found this really helpful. It does really break down the process step by step with lots of activities. So that would be one module that I would, or
That's
one
great.
resource that I would, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then sorry, one more thing. Do you have any resources for systematic or critical literature reviews that you could add to the resource list?
Yeah, I don't off the top of my head, but I do have some resources. Maybe, I don't know, Michael, would I be able to send maybe some of those to you? And
we'll put them all up at the slides.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah.
There's a question in the
Thank you.
chat too. How does using a synthesis matrix compare to adding notes in Zotero, for example? Do you think that one is more effective than the other for organizing literature, or do they serve different purposes? Have you guys used Zotero before? Yeah, I like Zotero, but do you have a?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, when you're adding those notes in Zotero, I think that's like a really great, how do I want to phrase this? I would say that like where Zotero is going to give you maybe a broader picture of like all of your sources that you're using, a synthesis matrix is going to be much more granular, going to focus in on like, we can go back to that slide here, 2 sources, right? So on the far left side of the synthesis matrix, we got your citations, your concepts and themes, your main ideas. And it's going to allow you to really kind of see how just a couple of sources are really speaking to each other. And you might, of course, expand this matrix as you're building more ideas. But it's designed to get you to really think about the connections between a handful of sources. Whereas Zotero, you're going to see all of your notes, right, from all of your sources. That's not to say that like Zotero is not also able to do this, right? I think you could absolutely use Zotero in a way that mimics and mirrors a synthesis matrix. So if you feel confident in the way that you use Zotero, I think it's one of the best reference resources out there. But it does have a bit of a learning curve, right? It's not the easiest resource to dive into. So if you have Zotero, I'd say, and you know how to use it, I'd say take advantage of it. If that kind of software like that, or Zendeley, or Notion is another example of a reference building software. If those kind of softwares kind of intimidate you, I would say that a synthesis matrix is going to be a resource that's really broken down to the bare essentials. Makes it really easy to think about synthesis.
I'll do a plug too on Zotero. We do a Zotero. Well, it's with the library. The library does a Zotero session at the beginning of every year. And I'm not sure, does Zotero cost outside of, like, would it cost if you weren't with the university? Because I know that we get it.
I think it's free.
Yeah, okay. I was gonna say, I think it might just be a free software, but yeah, it does have a learning curve. But the library, there's a reference librarian who does a presentation at the beginning of every year on how to use it, and they do a really good job.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out.
Any other questions? All right.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you all for coming to this workshop. with us. As we stated earlier, Spencer and I are available to help you all further with any more specific questions or to provide any consultation that may be of use to you. So feel free to either email us or book an appointment on our Writing Center webpage.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. All right. See you.